60 birds spilled out of the crates and scattered across the young orchard like gray smoke breaking apart in the wind, running low and fast between the rows of apple and pear saplings. And Marlowe Feist stood at the top of the slope with her hand still resting on the last crate, watching them go, saying nothing at all. She did not chase them. She did not call after them. She had spent her savings on them, and now she simply let them run, which struck the men leaning on the fence along Coldwater Bend Road as the single most foolish thing they had watched a Feist do in 3 generations. And that was a family with a long record of foolishness by their reckoning. One of them, a big square man named Dellard Krebin, who owned 400 acres of good bottomland east of the ridge and never let anyone forget it, spat into the dust and shook his head slow, the way a man does when he has already decided how a thing will end. Guinea fowl. Not chickens that lay, not turkeys that dress out heavy for a table, not anything a person could sell or eat with much pleasure. 60 birds that would holler all day and roost in trees and die by the dozen to the first fox that got curious, loosed on purpose into an orchard that had produced nothing worth hauling to market in 9 long years. If you have ever been told that the thing you loved, or the thing you inherited, or the small stubborn hope you carried was not worth the trouble, do me a small kindness and press the like button on this video and leave a comment telling me the town you are watching from tonight, because I would like to see how far this story travels. Say the name of your place. That is all. Now let me take you back to how Marlowe ended up on that slope with 60 birds and a county full of doubt, and why the men on the fence were about to be wrong in a way none of them would ever quite live down. Marlowe Feist was 23 this spring. She came back to the ridge above the little town of Harlow Gap, and she did not come back because she had a plan. She came back because there was nowhere else that felt like it belonged to her, and because the deed of the orchard had passed into her name when her great-uncle Osric Feist died in the winter with no children and no wife, and no one left but a grandniece he had met perhaps 6 times in her life. The place sat at the end of Coldwater Bend Road, where the pavement gave out and turned to a pale gravel that rattled under the truck, 41 acres folded into the eastern flank of a hill the old maps called Sallow Ridge, and most of it was the orchard, and the orchard was, by every account she heard in her first month back, finished. People said it plainly, without malice, the way they might tell you a well had gone dry. The Feist orchard doesn't bear any more. Osric let it go. Nothing to be done with it now but bulldoze the trees and run cattle, if the ground would even carry cattle, which some doubted. She heard this at the feed store in Harlow Gap, and she heard it at the single gas station where a woman named Junie Talvase ran the register and knew the movements of every soul in the county. And she heard it from Dellard Krebin himself, who stopped his truck in the road one afternoon and rolled down his window and offered, in the tone of a man doing charity, to take the whole 41 acres off her hands for a price that would have insulted a starving man. She said no. She said it flat, without heat, the way she said most things, and she watched something shift behind Krebin's eyes, a small recalculation, because a girl alone on a dead orchard was supposed to be grateful for any offer at all. He drove off telling himself she'd come around by autumn. She did not come around. Instead, she walked the rows. That was the first thing she did that anyone remarked on, and the remarks were not kind. For most of a week she walked the orchard, slow up one row and down the next, stopping under trees, standing there for long stretches doing nothing a passing eye could name, running her hand along the bark, turning over leaves, crouching to look at the ground beneath. She kept a small notebook with a cracked green cover in her jacket pocket, and now and then she wrote something in it, and then she went on. Junie Talvase reported to the gas station regulars that the Feist girl had been seen standing in the middle of her orchard for the better part of an hour, not doing a single thing, and the general verdict was that grief did strange things to people, and that she would either sell to Krebin or leave before the first frost. But Marlowe had seen something in those rows that no one else had bothered to look for, because looking took time, and time was the one thing the men in a hurry to write the orchard off had never been willing to spend on it. The trees were not dead. Some of them, the oldest, the ones her great-uncle's own father had put in the ground, were tired and half-wild and choked with sucker growth, but they were not dead. They set fruit. She had found small hard apples clinging to the high branches, and pears the size of a child's fist, knotted and scarred and inedible, and when she cut one open with her pocket knife, the flesh inside was clean and white, and it smelled, faintly, like something worth remembering. The problem was not the trees. The problem, she began to understand, as she read the ground and read the leaves, and read the notebook she'd found in Osric's kitchen drawer, was everything that lived in the orchard alongside the trees. The bark was scarred with the tunnels of borers. The leaves were lace where insects had been at them. And in the heavy grass between the rows, when she waded through it, the ground moved. It shimmered and jumped. Grasshoppers rose around her knees in clouds, and beetles, and the small pale hoppers that would grow into worse things. And she understood that Osric had not lost the orchard to old age. He had lost it to appetite. Something had been eating the orchard alive from the roots to the crown for the better part of a decade, and no amount of spray he could afford on a pension had turned the tide. And so he had stopped fighting, and the ground had won. That was where things stood the day Marlowe drove into Harlow Gap and sat across the desk from the county extension man, a decent enough fellow named Pruitt Hallam, who wore a short-sleeved shirt in all weather and had a poster of insect life cycles thumbtacked to his wall. She laid it out for him plainly, the borers and the beetles and the hoppers rising in clouds, and she asked him what a person did about a thing like that on 41 acres with almost no money. Pruitt Hallam rubbed his jaw and told her the truth, as the truth was understood by everyone with a degree and a spray schedule, which was that she would need a program, a serious one, ground application and aerial if she could afford it, tank after tank of chemistry laid down on a calendar through the whole growing season. And that even then, on trees that far gone, she would likely be throwing good money after bad, and that Krebin's offer, all things considered, was not unkind. He said this gently. He was not a cruel man. He simply believed, as everyone believed, that the orchard was not worth the trouble. And Marlowe thanked him and folded her notebook and drove the pale gravel of Coldwater Bend Road back up to the ridge. And she did not buy a single tank of chemistry, because she could not have afforded even the first application, and because something her great-aunt had said had already begun to work on her in the quiet way the true things do. Her great-aunt was named Verba Suley, and she was Osric's sister, 87 years old that spring, and she lived alone in a narrow white house at the edge of Harlow Gap with a garden that put every other garden in the county to shame, and a manner of speaking that used up as few words as a person could and still be understood. Verba had earned the right to say little. She had buried a husband and 2 brothers and a daughter, and she had kept that garden through every one of those winters, and she wore men's work trousers and rubber boots caked with soil without a flicker of self-consciousness, because she had long ago stopped caring what anyone thought a woman her age ought to wear. Marlowe had gone to see her in the second week, more out of duty than hope, and had ended up sitting on the porch step while Verba dead-headed a row of marigolds, and Marlowe had described the orchard and its plague of appetite, expecting nothing, and Verba had worked in silence for a while and then said, without looking up, that when she was a girl on that same ridge there had been no spray to buy, and the orchard had borne heavy every single year, and that her father, who was Marlowe's great-great-grandfather, a man named Alton Feist, dead now more than 60 years, had kept birds in it. Guineas, she said. Just that one word for a moment. Then she said her father let them run the rows, and they ate everything that moved, and they asked for nothing but a place to roost, and the orchard hung so full some years the limbs cracked. She snipped a dead marigold and dropped it in her apron, and added, in the same flat tone, that people had laughed at Alton too at first, And then they had come around to buying his fruit at any price he named. And then the world had gotten in a hurry and forgotten how it had ever been done. And everyone had gone to spraying because spraying was quick, and a man could do it on a Saturday. And the birds had been let go, and that she supposed was progress. She did not say it bitterly. She said it the way you report the weather. And then she said the thing that Marlowe wrote down in the cracked green notebook that very night, and would come back to more times than she could count in the seasons ahead. Verba said, "The ground remembers what you feed it and what you starve it. Feed it patience, and it feeds you back." She said it once, quiet. And then she asked if Marlowe wanted a jar of beans for her supper, and that was the end of it. Marlowe drove home in the dark and sat at Osric's kitchen table with the notebook open and the one bare bulb burning overhead. And she found, going through the drawer again more carefully this time, a second book beneath the first, older, its spine gone soft, and inside it was the handwriting of Alton Feist himself, faded brown ink on ruled paper, a farmer's ledger of a kind. And among the columns of weights and prices and weather, she found over and over across the years the same small entries. Turned out the birds into the north rows. 2 hatched this spring, kept 40. And once, near the back, underlined once by a hand long since gone to dust, a line that read, "The birds are the whole of it, everything else is just tending." Marlowe sat with that for a long while. Outside, the orchard hollered with its plague of insects in the summer dark, and inside she held a dead man's ledger, and between the two of them, the living orchard in the writing hand. She made up her mind. She would not spray. She would not sell. She would do the one thing the entire county had forgotten how to do, and would certainly laugh at her for trying, because it cost almost nothing and it could not be done in a hurry, and she had, if she had anything at all, time. Getting 60 guinea fowl was not, as it turned out, a simple errand, and it was the acquiring of them that gave Harlow Gap its first real season of entertainment at Marlowe's expense. Guineas were not a thing anyone raised for money anymore, and the few people who kept them the way you keep a cranky dog, more from habit than reason. She found her first 24 Keats, the little striped chicks, through a classified notice from a woman 3 counties over who was glad to be rid of them, and she raised them in a brooder box in Osric's back room through a stretch of April, feeding them and warming them and losing a few, the way you always lose a few, and writing down in the green notebook exactly how many and when and why, so that she would know better the next time. She got more from a swap meet, and more from an old man near the river who had let his flock go feral and was happy to sell her the one she could catch. By the time the young orchard grass was thick and the insects were rising in their worst clouds of the year, she had 'em. 60 birds gray and speckled and loud as a schoolyard, and she loaded them into borrowed crates and hauled them up to the top of the orchard slope on a bright morning when, as luck or ill luck would have it, half the fence-line loafers of Coldwater Bend Road happened to be watching. She had not meant it as a spectacle. It only became one because Dellard Krebin had stopped by with 2 other landowners to look, one last time, at the ground he still expected to buy cheap, and there they were when she opened the crates. She opened them one after another and stepped back and let the birds pour out and scatter into the rows, and she did not chase or herd or fret, and that was the part they could not get over. A person who paid money for animals ought to at least try to keep them. Krebin said, loud enough to carry, that she'd just fed 60 suppers to every fox and hawk on Sallow Ridge, and one of the men with him laughed, and the other allowed as how the girl had more money than sense, which was rich. Everyone agreed later, given that the girl had almost no money at all. Junie Talvez had it all by that afternoon, the whole scene, the crates and the scattering birds, and the way the Feist girl had just stood there watching them run like she was watching a sunset, and the gas station verdict hardened into something close to certainty. She'd be gone by Christmas. Krebin would have the land by spring. It was almost a shame, one of them said, A young thing like that throwing herself away on a dead orchard and a flock of hollering guineas. But you couldn't tell some people, and the Feists had always been that way, contrary right down to the bone. And through all of it, up on the slope in the bright morning, Marlowe stood with her hand on the last empty crate and watched 60 birds vanish into the deep grass of the rows. And she felt something she had not felt since she'd come back to the ridge, which was that for the first time she was doing exactly what the ground had been asking her to do all along. What the fence line prophets did not account for because it could not be seen in a morning or a week was what a guinea fowl actually does with its days when you turn it loose in a grass orchard thick with everything that crawls and hops and bores. It hunts. It hunts from the moment the light comes up until the moment it goes back to the trees at dusk, moving through the grass in a loose, talkative company. And what it hunts is precisely the appetite that had been eating the orchard alive. Grasshoppers, beetles, the pale hoppers before they could grow, ticks, which mattered to no one yet but would matter later. The birds worked the rows all day, every day for free, asking nothing but a handful of scratch grain thrown out at evening to bring them near, and a place in the low branches to roost safe from the foxes Krebin had promised would eat them. And it turned out the birds were far cannier about foxes than the men who mocked them, posting sentries and raising a racket that scattered anything that came skulking, so that Marlowe lost far fewer than the county had gleefully predicted. She lost some. She wrote down each one. But the flock held, and the flock hunted, and by the time the summer had turned toward its long, hot middle, something had begun to happen in the orchard that no one but Marlowe was in a position to notice, because no one but Marlowe was walking the rows. The grass stopped shimmering. That was the first sign, and she found it not as a triumph but as a small strangeness one evening in July when she waded out to throw the scratch grain and realized she was not walking through the usual boil of grasshoppers rising around her knees. She stood still in the row and watched, and there were a few, always a few, but not the clouds, not the plague. And she took out the green notebook and wrote the date and the single word fewer. And she stood a while longer in the falling light with the birds gabbling around her ankles, picking through the grass, and she let herself feel, quietly, that Alton Feist had been telling the truth across 60 years. She did not tell anyone. There was nothing yet to tell that would have meant anything to a man like Krebin, who measured a farm in acres and tractors and tank sprayers, and who would have looked at an orchard with slightly fewer grasshoppers and seen nothing at all. Marlowe understood that the proof would have to grow on the trees, and that it would take more than one summer, and she settled into the long patience of the thing the way her great-aunt had settled into that garden across all those hard years, without ceremony, one evening of scratch grain at a time. She did the tending, too, because Alton's ledger had told her the birds were the whole of it, but everything else was just tending. And so through that first summer and into the fall, she worked the trees themselves in the hours the birds worked the grass. She pruned out the dead wood and the water sprouts, learning as she went, ruining a few limbs before her hand got sure, and she scraped the borer scars and painted them and cleared the choking growth from around the old trunks so the light could get down to the ground. She had no money for equipment, so she did it with a hand saw and loppers and a ladder that had been Osric's, and her palms blistered and healed and blistered again, and finally went hard. And she kept the green notebook in her jacket through all of it, writing down which trees answered to the pruning and which sulked, which rows the birds favored when the first cool nights came, how the fruit was setting on the oldest trees now that the leaves were whole again and drinking full sun. The apples at fall were still small and still scarce and still not worth hauling anywhere, but they were clean. When she cut them open, there were no tunnels, no rot, no worm, and the flesh was white and firm, and it tasted, she thought, like nothing she had ever bought in a store, like something that had been growing on that ridge in that exact place, waiting to be tasted for 100 years. She picked what little there was and gave most of it away, to Verba to Junie at the gas station as a kind of quiet joke, to Pruitt Halome, the extension man who had told her it couldn't be done, and she said nothing about the birds, and she let the fruit make its own argument, which was, at that stage, a very small one that hardly anybody heard. The winter came down hard on Sallow Ridge that year, and the flock huddled in the roost trees, and Marlowe hauled scratch grain through the snow and lost a handful more birds to the cold and to a great horned owl that worked the ridge for a couple of hungry weeks, and she wrote each one down, and she waited. She spent the dark months at Osric's kitchen table, going through Alton Feist's ledger line by line, copying its wisdom into the green notebook in her own hand, so it would not be lost if the old book finally fell apart, and she found in it 100 small things the county had forgotten. She found that Alton had let the birds hatch their own young in the tall grass rather than buying more each spring, keeping the best hens and letting the flock renew itself, and that he had thinned it back each fall so it never outgrew the orchard's ability to feed it, and that he had kept a rooster or two of a heavy breed among the guineas because, he had written, the big birds settle the little ones and give the whole company backbone against a fox. She found the prices he had gotten for his fruit in years when other orchards had failed, and they were not small prices, and she understood that there had been a time when the Feist name on a bushel of apples had meant something in 3 counties, before the hurry came and the spraying came, and the birds were let go and the meaning was forgotten. She copied it all down. And when the spring came again, her second spring on the ridge, she let the hens nest in the tall grass exactly as Alton had, and the flock renewed itself. And she got a heavy old rooster from the feral man near the river and turned him out among them, and the orchard woke into its second year of being hunted clean. That was the year the fruit came, not in the flood that would come later, but in the first real showing, enough that for the first time Marlowe had more than she could give away, and she did not know what to do with it, and it was Verba again who pointed the way in as few words as possible. Marlowe had brought her a basket, and Verba had turned one apple over in her old spotted hand and bitten it and chewed and looked out at her garden a long while, and then she had said only, "Sell them to somebody who knows the difference." She would not say more than that. But Marlowe understood, and she thought about who in the world knew the difference between an apple and an apple, and she thought of the one restaurant in the county worth the name, a place 2 towns over on the river road called the Weir House, run by a woman named Callista Braga, who had come back from cooking in some city and opened a kitchen that people drove an hour to eat in, and who was known to pay real money for things that were grown right. So Marlowe put a case of her small clean apples in the truck and drove the river road on a weekday morning and carried them into the Weir House kitchen and set them on the steel table and said plainly that she had grown them on Sallow Ridge with no spray of any kind, that birds kept the trees clean, and that she thought Callista Braga might taste the difference. And Callista Braga, who had heard 1,000 growers make 1,000 claims, picked one up and cut it and ate it standing there. And then she stood very still for a moment, the way Marlowe herself stood in the rows. And then she asked how many more there were and what Marlowe wanted for them. And that was the first sale, the first real proof laid down on a steel table in a kitchen, the day the dead orchard first paid its way. It was not at first a great deal of money, and it did not change anything overnight, and Marlowe was careful, in the way she was careful about everything, not to make more of it than it was. She sold the Weir House what she had and drove home and wrote the sale in the green notebook, and the next week Callista Braga called her about pears, and the week after that she called to say a chef friend of hers in the city had tasted the fruit on a menu and wanted to know where it came from. And slowly, in the manner of true things, word began to move. It did not move through advertising because Marlowe had no money for any, and would not have trusted it if she had. It moved the way water moves through ground, finding its own channels. A cook told a cook. A diner at the Weir House asked her waiter where the apple and the tart had grown, and the waiter, proud of it, told her Sallow Ridge, the Feist orchard, birds keep it clean, no spray. Junie Talvez, who had spent a year predicting Marlowe's departure, now had a new and better story to tell, and she told it to everyone who bought gas that the Feist girl was selling apples to the warehouse at $1 apiece and turning up her nose at Krebin. And the story got better every time Junie told it, and Marlowe, up on the ridge, just kept doing the thing. She let the hens nest, she thinned the flock in the fall. She pruned and scraped and painted and threw the scratch grain at evening and walked the rows in the falling light while 60 and then 70 and then 80 birds worked the grass clean around her. And she wrote it all down, and the fruit got better and there got to be more of it. And she held the line she had drawn against spray and against selling and against hurry, and she almost never had to explain herself to anyone, because the fruit did the explaining. Dellard Krebin was not a man to change his mind quickly or quietly, and he did neither. He had watched the birds come and predicted their deaths, and he had watched them live and predicted the orchard would still fail. And when the fruit began to sell, he predicted it was a fad the city people would tire of. And he said all of this at the feed store in Harlow Gap, where his word carried weight. Because he was the biggest landowner for miles, and because he had never in his life been made to answer for being wrong. It was Krebin who said the thing that Marlowe's whole second summer would quietly disprove, and he said it on a Saturday morning at the feed store counter with half the county's farmers listening, when someone brought up the Feist girl and her birds and her fancy apples. Krebin said, flat, the way he said all his verdicts, that it was a parlor trick and nothing more, that a person could sell a few baskets of novelty apples to a fool restaurant for a season, but that birds don't scale and orchards need real programs and real capital, and that, mark his words, the first bad year, the first drought or hailstorm or real infestation, and the whole thing would come apart, and the girl would be back begging him to buy the ground, only by then it'd be worth less than he'd offered. Birds don't scale. He said it like a law of nature. The men at the counter nodded because it sounded like sense, and it was the kind of thing that had always been true in the world they knew, and Junie Talvez's husband carried it home and it went around. Birds don't scale, Krebin says, and it settled over the county as the last word on the matter. And that word would sit there, waiting, through one more turning of the seasons, until the summer the sky itself came to settle the argument. It came in the third summer, the summer everyone on the ridge and in the flat country below still talks about, the summer of the swarm. It had been a strange dry spring across the whole region, hot early and hotter through May, and in the sandy waste ground and the overgrazed pastures east of the ridge, in exactly the kind of dry, disturbed ground where such things breed when the weather turns wrong, the grasshoppers hatched in numbers no one living had seen. They built through June, unnoticed by most, the way disasters build, and then in the first hard heat of July they lifted. The county had known grasshopper years before, bad ones, but not like this. The swarm rose off the dry ground in the low country and moved on the wind up the valleys in a shimmering brown haze that people saw coming from miles off and did not, at first, understand. And it came down on the farms east of Sallow Ridge like a living weather. It stripped Dellard Krebin's soybeans to bare stems in an afternoon. It took the corn behind it. It went through gardens and orchards and hayfields, and the men who had real programs and real capital ran their sprayers day and night and could not lay chemistry down fast enough, could not cover the acres fast enough, because the swarm did not respect a spray calendar and did not care how many acres a man owned. It simply ate, moving with the wind, and behind it the good bottomland that Krebin had never let anyone forget he owned lay ruined and bare under the July sun. Pruitt Hallam, the extension man, drove the county roads with his mouth set in a grim line and told everyone the same thing, that it was the worst he'd seen in 30 years, that there was nothing to be done but wait it out and count the loss. The swarm reached the Feist orchard on the 5th day. Marlowe saw it come, the brown haze lifting over the ridgeline on the hot wind, and she stood at the top of the orchard slope in the same place she had stood 3 years before, with her hand on an empty crate, and she watched it come, and she did not run for a sprayer she did not own, and she did not despair, because she had spent 3 years learning to trust the thing she had built, and there was, in truth, nothing else she could do. The swarm came down over the orchard, and then the strangest thing happened, the thing that half the county would drive up the ridge to see for themselves before the summer was out, because they could not believe it from the telling. The orchard did not go silent under the swarm. It erupted. 90-some guinea fowl that had spent 3 years hunting every hopper and beetle in those rows went off like the whole ridge had caught fire, a shrieking storm of birds rising through the grass and the low branches, and they fell on the swarm with an appetite that matched it, and they ate. They ate all day. The grasshoppers that came down into the feist rows did not come back up, or the great mass of them did not, and the birds worked from first light past the point where a normal evening would have sent them to roost, gorged and still hunting, and the flock that the county had laughed at, the flock that Krebin had sworn would feed the foxes, met the worst infestation in 30 years head-on and held the line. Not perfectly. Nothing holds perfectly. The swarm was vast, and it took some fruit at the edges, and it stripped the tall grass in the outer rows before the birds could clear it. But where every sprayed and capitalized farm in the low country lay ruined, the feist orchard at the end of the swarm still had its leaves, still had its fruit hanging heavy on the oldest trees, still stood green on the flank of Sallow Ridge like an island the flood had gone around. Marlowe walked the rows the morning after the swarm had moved on north, and the birds were still working, sated and slow now, picking through grass that lay flattened and chewed in places, but green and standing in most, and she found the fruit clean and whole on the trees, and she took out the green notebook and she wrote the date, and she wrote the word held, just the one word, the way her great-aunt would have, and she stood in the row a long time in the early light. She did not call anyone. She did not need to. Word of it was already moving down off the ridge faster than she could have carried it, because a man named Torvald Enns, who farmed the parcel just below hers, had driven up in the middle of the swarm to see if the girl needed help, and had seen the birds at their work, and had gone back down and told it at the feed store, and no one had believed him, and so more men had driven up to see, and they had stood along Coldwater Bend Road, exactly where they had stood 3 summers before, to laugh, and this time they did not laugh. They watched an orchard full of birds eat a plague alive. They watched it hold, and they drove back down to their own ruined fields with something working in them that was not easy to name, and the county, which had spent 3 years certain of one thing, began slowly, in the way of such things, to become certain of the opposite. Dellard Krebin came up the ridge himself in the last week of July, alone, in the evening, which was not his way, and he did not stop his truck in the road and roll down the window the way he had that first year. He parked it and got out and walked up the slope to where Marlowe was throwing the scratch grain, and he stood at the edge of the row with his hat in his hand, an old man suddenly, his bottom land bare behind him for miles, and he looked at the green orchard and the birds working the grass, and he did not say anything for a while. And Marlowe let him not say it, because she had learned patience from a woman who had buried half her family and kept a garden through all of it. When Krebin finally spoke, he did not make a large production out of it. He said he'd been wrong. He said it flat, looking at the birds and not at her. The way a man says a hard, true thing he has carried up a hill on purpose. He said he'd farmed that low ground 40 years, the only way he knew, and the sky had just taken it all in a week, and he'd stood up here and watched a flock of birds do what all his sprayers couldn't. And he wanted her to know he'd been wrong, and that if she ever wanted to run birds on his ground once he'd got it back into something, he'd pay for the privilege and count himself lucky. Then he asked, quieter, how a person got started with a thing like this, And Marlowe, who had every right in the world to say something sharp and said nothing sharp at all, told him plainly, the way Verba had told her. She said the ground remembers what you feed it and what you starve it. She said feed it patience, and it feeds you back. And Krebin turned that over, hat in his hands, and then he put his hat on and thanked her and walked back down to his truck, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. The years after the swarm were the years Marlowe had earned, though she never called them that. The word had gone all the way out now, past the county, past the warehouse, into the city kitchens where Calista Braga's chef friends built menus around fruit that could not be got anywhere else. And there came to be a waiting list for the finest apples and pears, and a small hand-lettered sign at the end of Cold Water Bend Road, and cars that came up the pale gravel on autumn weekends so that people could buy a bushel from the orchard that beat the swarm. Because that was the story now, that was the thing that traveled. The birds and the plague and the island of green. Marlowe could have grown it fast. There were people, more of them every year, who wanted to give her money to plant 50 new acres and buy trucks and take on the debt and make the thing big all at once. And she said no to every one of them the way she had said no to Krebin at the beginning, flat and without heat, because Alton Feist's ledger had taught her that a flock must never outgrow the ground's ability to feed it. And she understood that an orchard was only the same thing scaled up, and that the moment she grew faster than she could tend the way it wanted to be tended, she would have to reach for the sprayer and the debt and the hurry, and she would become, in the end, just another farm the next swarm could take in a week. So she grew it the same way she'd done everything else, by patience, not debt. She planted a few new rows each spring from the seed of her best trees, and let the young orchard she had once loosed the birds into come slowly into its full bearing, and she let the flock renew itself in the tall grass and thinned it each fall so it never outran the rows. And she taught a Harlow Gap teenager named Sable Durock, a serious, quiet girl who reminded Marlowe of herself, how to walk a row and read the leaves and keep a notebook. And she let demand pull the thing along at the speed the ground could carry, and no faster, and it grew anyway, steady, into something no swarm and no dry year ever took from her again. Verba Sully lived to see most of it, which was the mercy in it. And she came up the ridge one October in her 91st year, driven by Sable in Marlowe's truck because she could no longer manage the trip alone. And she walked the rows slowly with a cane, in her men's trousers and her caked rubber boots. And she looked at the trees her father had planted a century before, heavy now with clean fruit, and the birds working the grass beneath them exactly as they had when she was a girl. And she did not say very much because she never did. But she stopped under the oldest tree and put her spotted hand flat against the bark for a long moment, and Marlowe saw her lips move without sound, saying something to somebody who had been dead 60 years. And then Verba took her hand off the tree and looked at Marlowe and said only that Alton would be pleased, and that it had all been here the whole time, and that people just quit looking. Then she asked in the same breath whether Marlowe had put up any of the pears, because she'd like a jar to take home, and that was the last time Verba Sully walked the orchard. She died in her sleep in the White House at the edge of Harlow Gap the following spring, 89 words spoken to Marlowe across 3 years by Marlowe's own reckoning in the green notebook, where she had written every one of them down, and Marlowe buried her beside Osric and Alton in the little ridge cemetery within sight of the trees, and she planted a young pear at the head of the grave from the seed of the oldest tree, and she did not make a ceremony of it, because Verba would not have wanted one. There is a morning now every year in the early summer that Marlowe Feist keeps as her own, and it is the morning she loosed the 60 birds, or as near to it as the calendar comes. She is not young any more herself, and Sable Durock runs most of the walking of the rows, and the orchard covers the whole flank of sallow ridge and trees that bear so heavy some years the limbs crack the way Verba said they used to, and the flock is a great gabbling company that hunts the grass clean from first light to dusk and asks for nothing but scratch grain and a branch to roost on. On that one morning, Marlowe goes up to the top of the orchard slope, to the exact place where she stood with her hand on an empty crate while men laughed at her from the fence, and she stands there and watches the birds move through the rows in the early light, and she does nothing a passing eye could name. She just watches them. And if you drove up Coldwater Bend Road on that morning and saw a woman standing motionless in an orchard, doing nothing at all, you might think, as the whole county once thought, that there was nothing happening there worth your time. But you would be looking at the thing itself. You would be looking at 41 acres that a dead man's patience saved and a young woman's patience restored, at an orchard that beat the sky in a summer everyone remembers, at proof laid down not in argument but in fruit, that the overlooked thing, the mocked thing, the thing they swore wasn't worth the trouble, was the whole of it all along, and everything else was just tending. So if this story found you tonight, and if you have ever carried something small and stubborn that the people around you swore was worthless, a piece of ground, a gift, a way of doing things the world got in too much of a hurry to remember, share this with the person in your life who needs to hear it. The one who's been told what they have or what they are isn't worth much, because they may only need to know that someone, somewhere, waited and was proven right. Tell me in the comments about the thing you were told to give up on, and whether you held the line or wish you had. And tell me the name of the town or the city or the quiet stretch of road you're watching from tonight, wherever you are in this wide country or beyond it, because I read every single comment that comes in on these, every one. And I would like to stand at the top of the slope a while with you and watch the birds work and know that the story traveled that far.